In Essential Task 10.5, we are going to end our unit on sensation and perception by describing the other sensory processes. Simply put, the College Board absolutely alludes to the 5 remaining senses on the AP exam, in addition to vision and hearing. They are simply not emphasized to the extent of the other 2. As a result, we will group these 5 remaining senses together and talk about them in this final essential task, which, as you can see, I recommend a horizontal piece of paper. Proceeding into the remaining senses, we're going to be talking about 3 senses that you've assuredly heard of: smell, touch, and taste, but also talk about 2 senses, the kinesthetic sense and our vestibular sense, that you might have less familiarity with. We'll start with smell. Smell begins when over 350 different odor molecules that exist in our environment eventually reach the olfactory receptor cells at the top of our nasal cavity. So if you look here at the diagram, you see here the nasal cavity, you see a region labeled as the olfactory bulb. We talked about this back in Unit 8, but we talked about a region of the brain called the thalamus, and I said it was responsible for beginning the processing of all of our senses except smell. We now have a region of our body responsible for the processing of smell. It is called the olfactory bulb, and the 350 plus different odor molecules in our environment can combine, similar to mixing paints, to produce 10,000 plus different odors, which could be detected by our olfactory bulb. If you watch around the 5-minute mark of the clip here at the top left corner, I think Crash Course does a good job providing visuals in combination with the sense of smell. I should note that smell itself can sometimes just be called olfaction. They might not list the word smell on the AP exam, so it is important to note that synonym, and if you know that synonym, that also helps then connect to the region of the body, the olfactory bulb. When I look at that word olfactory, I also think about the idea of it being a smelly olfactory as a way of connecting smell to the word either olfaction or olfactory. One interesting thing to note is that research has shown that females are actually superior in detecting smells relative to men. If I was an evolutionary psychologist, I would relate that to perhaps the ability to differentiate between different dating partners and using the sense of smell as a means of selecting one over another. Proceeding onward, we have the kinesthetic sense, or kinesthesia, which is our overall sense of body position. Obviously, this second phrase down here should be extended over to the right a little bit. It says example. But the kinesthetic sense is our sense for body position and our overall movement of individual body parts, making it so that we don't necessarily need to look at the floor and watch our feet hit the ground to really know that our body is moving in a certain direction or that our feet are positioned where they are. If you've ever been in a crowded room, whether that's a supermarket or a concert or an amusement park, you know that when a room is really crowded, you might need to dart between different groups of people, make quick little movements in order to get from point A to point B. Well, your kinesthetic sense allows you in those positions to know where your body is oriented relative to other people and know when you need to move your shoulder in one direction or kind of slip by another person in another direction. Your kinesthetic sense allows you to know your relation body part wise and positions movement wise, especially in those crowded areas. If anybody plays sports, your kinesthetic sense is incredibly important. Your ability to stay in bounds, for example, is a good byproduct of your kinesthetic sense. You don't necessarily always need to look down at the field or the court to know if you're in bounds. You can kind of position yourself, relatively speaking, taking into consideration all of the other environmental factors, and stay relatively in bounds for the most part using your kinesthetic sense. Obviously, sometimes you should look down, but generally speaking, if you're on the edges of the field or edges of the court, you can find yourself remaining in bounds using the kinesthetic sense, the same way that you can navigate through a crowded room or through a concert or through any crowded environment, knowing and understanding your position and movement. We'll watch the clip here to the right. It's a really fascinating clip. It's an individual who simply has no kinesthetic sense, which might sound odd, but he actually needs to see his foot hit the ground in order to understand that it is now time to move his other foot. This is something that we would typically take for granted, but this is the extreme element of not understanding where your body is positioned, or in this case, where your limbs are positioned. But our third sense is simply our sense of touch. It's our largest sense, and touch sensations can be divided up into a few different categories. We have things like pressure, cold, the inverse of that of heat or warm, and then pain receptors. So our skin has different receptors pertaining to the different types of touch sensations that we are experiencing, and it can obviously be a mixture of a variety of different. One of the interesting elements of touch is that regions of our body that are more sensitive than others to touch sensations actually have a higher degree of receptors. So, for example, if you were to actually look at what the body looked like relative to touch receptors, it would look something like this, but your lips and your mouth are giant, your fingers and your hands are really giant, but other regions of your body, like your elbows and your knees, not so much. It's because regions like the palm of your hands have a significantly higher concentration of touch receptors than, for example, your elbow. So if you've ever had a paper cut, it can feel incredibly painful because, simply put, there is a ton of pain receptors in your fingertips. There's not nearly as many, for example, in your back. If you have the equivalent injury of a paper cut on your back or on your elbow, it might be annoying, but it's not going to feel as bad because there's simply not as many touch sensation receptors in those regions of the body. The parts of our body that are higher degrees of sensitivity have more receptors, and as a result, those are the parts of our body that little pains like a paper cut typically feel worse. We call the visual that I showed you there in the bottom right corner sensory homunculus. I don't envision them using that term, but that is technically the term that we use for the visual of the body there. Continue on a little bit with pain. There is a phenomenon called gait theory that is in relation to pain, and it's the general idea that when pain receptors experience sensation, so for example, you scrape your elbow while snowboarding, you scrape your elbow while skating, while skiing, anything in between, that the signal of pain detected by the pain receptors on your skin could reach the spinal cord, right? Pain receptors, going back to Unit 8, sensory neurons, pain receptors in this case, detect some type of sensory stimulation and send it to the spinal cord. The spinal cord's responsibility is, generally speaking, to send that information to the brain, because it is in the brain, in the somatosensory cortex, where we perceive and process the sense of touch. Gait control theory argues that if pain reaches a certain level, or if given the certain conditions that we'll talk about in a moment, that the pain messages can reach the spinal cord, but then the spinal cord can almost act like a gate and it'll say, you know what, we're not going to send this information to the brain. We don't want the brain to process this pain because obviously that would therefore hurt. And if the information about a pain sensation doesn't actually reach the brain, you're not going to process it. If the spinal cord is damaged or there's something inhibiting the ability of messages to get from the spinal cord to the brain in regards to what you're touching, you're not going to feel anything. So for example, you could have an individual with a scalding hot piece of metal resting on their lap and not quote unquote feel it if they're paralyzed from the waist below, because pain messages don't actually reach the brain. They get stuck perceivably in the spinal cord. Same general idea though for individuals who are, for example, getting into an accident while riding their bike. They might scrape their elbow. That pain message might be so severe, the spinal cord might say, you know, let's close the gate. Let's not send this up to the brain. And as a result, that individual might not experience pain to the extent that they might anticipate after a severe injury. There's some belief that acupuncture, a type of treatment, and even to some case massages, are actually designed to promote the gate closing phenomenon. By using the small pricks in acupuncture, let's trigger small degrees of pain. Let's try to promote the spinal cord's ability to demonstrate this gate closing effect so that other sensations in the future, which might be in relation to pain, can experience that gate closing effect. And maybe in the future, it can alleviate some of the pain that you've been experiencing, maybe back pain or something else. The fourth sense is one that you've probably not heard of, though we sort of alluded to it earlier. I made a comment back when we were talking about the ear that eventually we would talk in more depth about the inner ear, because in addition to the cochlea, there is a second region of the inner ear. It's the portion that's not the purple snail. It's the region here that looks like some ribbons or maybe some shoelaces that are in relation to a different element of our sensation, specifically our sense of orientation and balance. We call this our vestibular sense, and those regions, which you do need to note in the definition below where it says dizzy, are either called the vestibular sacs or the semicircular canals. They are attached to the inner ear, and what's important about them is that they themselves are filled with liquid, and when we move, it helps determine if we are balanced or if we are in the midst of an equilibrium. If you've ever experienced dizziness from a roller coaster or anything else in between, the reason is, once you get off of a roller coaster and are standing still, the liquid in the semicircular canals or the vestibular sacs are literally still moving, and as a result, you're getting messages to the brain in regards to movement, which is not actually happening. So dizziness is the sensation of movement without the actual movement, because the part of your inner ear that regulates balance and equilibrium is being continually stimulated in the aftermath of doing something at such a high speed, like going on a roller coaster, or even in some cases, honestly, something like teacups could do this as well. But that's what we call our vestibular sense. It might seem like an odd one, a weird one, but your vestibular sense allows you to, walk in a straight line without falling over, ensure that you know what is up and what is down and that you're moving appropriately, and you can very easily disrupt your vestibular sense in any of the circumstances in which you've ever become dizzy. The very last sense to talk about, might be my favorite sense, is the sense of taste. We have found that our tongue has receptors for 5 major taste sensations. You've probably heard of 4 of them, not as much the 5th one. They are sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. This might be a little bit surprising. A lot of people typically, when they see these 4 listed, they assume the 5th one's going to be something like spicy. It is in fact not. Spicy is more relation to pain of all things. The 5th taste sensation is actually one called umami. It's more of a savory flavor. I haven't seen it there in a while, but Trader Joe used to sell little packets of umami flavored seasoning. And if you get into cooking someday, you might be more familiar with that umami sound, particularly if you watch things, honestly, like the Food Network. A lot of times when they're describing flavors, they'll drop that 5th taste sensation. It's not a term that typically culturally we hear a lot, but it is in fact another taste sensation. And the general idea is that your tongue contains taste buds. The quantity of bumps can vary per person, but these taste buds can detect these various taste sensations. There are some individuals who have a higher density in quantity and concentration of taste buds who actually might experience flavors in more rich manners. We call these individuals super tasters. They have a relatively higher number of taste buds than the typical individual. So you might have 2 people taste the same food, but one person feel like it tastes off and another person feel like it tastes fine. The person that had that more intense taste might simply just be a super taster. They literally might taste things differently and with higher degree of intensity than an individual who's a non-super taster.